What if I told you the last words ever written in a respected doctor's journal were just 7 chilling words? Subject 247 screamed for 6 straight hours. That was November 15th, 1887. And just 3 weeks later, when Kentucky state officials finally broke into the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum, what they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 214 men, gone, vanished from nearby counties. All of them officially declared insane by the same trusted alienist Dr. Silas Crampton. And behind the asylum, a mass grave, with twice that number of bodies. For more than a century, Kentucky locked these records away, burying the truth deeper than the victims themselves. But tonight, we're opening those doors. And trust me, what happened in Kentucky could have happened anywhere in America. The story didn't begin with screams in the night. It began with something quieter, sadder, families desperate to bring their missing husbands, fathers, and brothers home. Frankfort in 1886 looked like a proud capital. Nearly 8,000 people lived there, the Kentucky River cutting through town as steamboats hauled bourbon and tobacco north. Limestone government buildings gleamed like monuments to progress. But underneath all that prosperity, wounds from the Civil War, corruption, and one institution that would become a nightmare. The Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum opened in 1874, a grand brick structure built on the Kirkbride plan. Its manicured lawns and towering cupola suggested hope, a place where the mentally ill could find dignity and healing. When Dr. Silas Crampton took charge in 1884, he came with glowing recommendations from Philadelphia and a reputation as a brilliant reformer. Tall, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, he carried himself with mechanical precision, always scribbling notes in his leather-bound journal, always watching. He spoke boldly. Insanity wasn't a curse, it was a puzzle, one that science could solve. And Governor James Proctor, eager to modernize Kentucky's institutions, gave Crampton free rein, full control of the asylum's budget, staff, and patients. At his side was head nurse Hannah Rutledge, stern, cold, efficient. Patients feared the sound of her footsteps long before they saw her face. In the beginning, the asylum housed just over 100 patients, war veterans shattered by battle, families too poor to care for relatives, vagrants swept up by local authorities. Most came from rural counties where superstition still ruled. But Crampton's vision reached far beyond caring for the truly afflicted. He had begun writing to pharmaceutical companies up north, promising to test new compounds that could revolutionize mental health treatment. The profits, if he succeeded, would be enormous. And all he needed was bodies, disposable men that nobody would miss. The first hints of something sinister came in spring of 1886. Families in Breathitt County began reporting men disappearing on trips to Frankfort. Take Samuel Hutchins, a blacksmith. He left home to sell horseshoes. A week later, his wife Mary learned Samuel had been locked inside the asylum, declared violently insane. When she finally arrived to see him, staff claimed he'd died overnight. Apoplexy, they said. Then came Hardy Peaton, a farmer from Cumberland County. Same story. Healthy one day, committed the next, dead within days of arrival. By the end of that year, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Men vanished at alarming rates, all declared insane by Crampton, all dead within weeks, and yet, nothing stopped him. The governor's political fund had been generously padded with money funneled straight from the asylum's accounts. Investigations were quietly shut down before they even began. Then came October 13th, 1886. Rain hammered against the asylum's windows. That night, records show the beginning of what Crampton chillingly called the accelerated treatment protocol. 23 new patients arrived that evening, all committed in a single day for public disturbance or vagrancy. What happened to them behind those locked brick walls? We may never know. But we do know this. A year later, when officials finally forced their way inside, the asylum was empty. Hundreds of men missing, hundreds more buried in unmarked pits, and a leather journal that ended with 7 terrifying words. Imagine being hauled away not for a crime, but for defending your family's honor. That's exactly what happened to Thomas Caldwell, a 34-year-old carpenter from Wolfe County. His only offense? Protecting his sister from a traveling salesman's unwanted advances. But the local magistrate decided Thomas's outburst wasn't bravery, it was madness. And with one stroke of the pen, he ordered Thomas committed to the asylum. His wife, Sarah, begged for mercy. She promised to pay fines, restitution, anything to bring her husband home. But her pleas were drowned out by the rattling wheels of the asylum wagon that carried Thomas away into the night. Inside the receiving room, things grew colder still. Gas lamps flickered against whitewashed walls, throwing shadows that made the place feel more like a stage for nightmares. Head nurse Hannah Rutledge moved briskly through the group of new arrivals. Names, ages, symptoms, all recorded in a thick ledger. Her assistant stripped each man of his belongings and clothes, issuing rough gray uniforms that erased their identities in an instant. From behind his cluttered desk, Dr. Silas Crampton watched it all. Glass vials, metal instruments, and his ever-present leather journal surrounded him. His sharp gray eyes scanned each man like a scientist examining specimens. When his gaze locked on Thomas Caldwell, he paused, pen hovering over the page. "Strong constitution," he murmured. "Good muscle tone, clear eyes. This one's promising," and for the advanced trials, Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. He didn't know what advanced trials meant, but the look in the doctor's eyes told him it wasn't about healing. The experiments began immediately. Those chosen for Crampton's special care were led into a sealed-off wing of the asylum. Windows blackened from the inside, hallways silent except for the echo of boots on stone. What lay beyond those doors looked less like a hospital and more like a medieval dungeon. Here, Crampton's so-called research revealed itself. First came cerebral stimulation, chemical injections delivered straight into the bloodstream while patients were strapped to iron tables. The compounds came from Pemberton Pharmaceuticals of Boston, eager to test new formulas away from the scrutiny of proper medical trials. The results were horrific. Some men convulsed so violently their screams shook the entire wing. Others collapsed into states so deep they appeared dead, breaths faint, pulses nearly gone. On October 16th, Thomas endured his first injection, a yellowish liquid that burned like fire through his veins. The world dissolved into madness, colors exploding, sounds twisting, his body bending in ways no human body should. He screamed words he didn't recognize, in languages he didn't know. And through it all, Dr. Crampton calmly timed every reaction with a pocket watch, scribbling notes as if Thomas were nothing more than an experiment, night after night. The treatments continued. Crampton developed a graduated exposure protocol, escalating doses and dangerous combinations, documenting how much suffering the human body could endure before breaking completely. Some patients went blind. Others lost all control of their muscles. Most didn't survive, and the dead were quickly carried away. Making space for the next shipment of men, Nurse Rutledge proved essential. Her medical skills weren't used for comfort. They were used to keep victims alive just long enough for more data. She revived men from cardiac arrest with crude electrical devices, dragging them back from death only so the experiments could continue. And disturbingly, she seemed to enjoy it, the power over life and death, the control. But secrecy was vital. When families started asking too many questions, Rutledge devised containment protocols. Visitors were handed forged death certificates and shown empty graves marked with their relatives' names. Those who pressed harder, demanded proof, were often declared insane themselves. One quick evaluation by Crampton, and they too vanished behind asylum walls. Through winter 1886 and spring 1887, the system ran like a well-oiled machine. By summer, over 200 men had disappeared into the asylum's hidden wing, their lives erased as if they'd never existed. But Crampton wasn't finished. His ambitions expanded, and so did his empire of suffering. Half the asylum was soon converted into laboratories and chambers for experiments. Genuine patients, people who actually needed care, were crammed into smaller spaces, neglected, forgotten. By then, Crampton's journals had multiplied into 7 thick volumes. Every page filled with cold, meticulous notes, sketches of twisted faces mid-seizure, dosage calculations, the very moment life slipped away. And his handwriting? Once precise, it had grown erratic, frantic, as if the experiments were consuming not just his patients, but his mind. Rutledge recruited new staff to support the work. Former Confederate soldiers, hardened by war and desperate for employment. Men who didn't flinch at screams, blood, or corpses. The asylum had transformed. What was once meant to be a place of healing had become a factory of horror, and the world outside still had no idea. How far would someone go to cover up hundreds of deaths? By 1887, the asylum's experiments had claimed so many lives that even disposing of the bodies had become a full-time operation. And that job often fell to the newcomers Dr. Crampton and Nurse Rutledge recruited. Many of these new hires were desperate men, recent immigrants from Ireland and Germany who barely spoke English, men who would never question orders as long as they had a roof over their heads and steady pay. Among them was Wilhelm Brennan, a young German who had arrived in Kentucky just 6 months earlier. He'd come chasing work in the coal mines, but when that failed, he gratefully accepted Rutledge's offer at the asylum. It gave him enough wages to send money home to Bavaria. At first, Wilhelm's duties sounded harmless: maintain equipment, clean up, and dispose of materials no longer useful. But inside Crampton's world, that phrase covered everything, from blood-stained clothing to human remains. The disposal problem grew as the body count skyrocketed. In the beginning, Crampton hid the deaths inside the asylum's own cemetery, padding records with lies to explain the mortality rate. But soon the numbers were too high, too suspicious. That's when Wilhelm made a grim discovery. The limestone caves under Frankfurt were perfect hiding places. Bodies could be dropped into bottomless crevices or left to dissolve in acidic pools deep underground. And then came an even darker scheme. Crampton began selling corpses. He struck deals with medical schools in the Northeast, prestigious institutions willing to pay handsomely for fresh cadavers. Preserved in ice, shipped north in coffins labeled as deceased asylum patients. These men became teaching tools for anatomy classes. Nobody questioned it. After all, wasn't it normal for the most disturbed patients to die so young? Dr. Marcus Wainwright at Harvard acted as Crampton's main contact, laundering payments through a network of shell companies. The profits were staggering, up to $200 for a single body. That was more than most Kentucky farmers earned in a year. Through all of this, one man endured longer than most: Thomas Caldwell. His strong body allowed him to survive trial after trial, even when others around him died within days. By July of 1887, Thomas had become one of Crampton's prized test subjects, living proof of how far the human body could be pushed. But survival came at a cost. His mind began to splinter under the endless injections and tortures. He slipped in and out of reality, drifting between delirium and clarity, and in those fleeting clear moments, Thomas noticed patterns. He could tell which chemicals were being used by the screams, the shrieks of men under injection, the sudden silences when death arrived, and the grinding sounds of Wilhelm's nightly disposals just before dawn. But Thomas wasn't the only one paying attention. Outside the asylum, families were finally comparing stories. His wife, Sarah Caldwell, led meetings in Wolfe County, gathering women whose husbands, sons, and brothers had all vanished after being taken by asylum officials. Similar groups rose up in Breathitt, Leslie, and Cumberland counties. They pushed for answers. They wrote to the governor, to state legislators. They asked for records. What they received were polite, empty letters claiming insanity often progressed rapidly in asylums, and death certificates signed by Dr. Crampton himself. Causes of death ranged from apoplexy to tuberculosis to general debility. But the families didn't buy it. Some traveled to the asylum gates demanding to see their loved ones. Many were turned away by armed guards. Others were allowed brief visits, only to realize the sedated, unfamiliar men they were shown were not their relatives. When they protested, asylum staff told them insanity had changed their appearance beyond recognition. The lies were unraveling. By late summer 1887, Sarah Caldwell had taken her fight to the press. She contacted editors in Lexington and Louisville, sending documents that pointed to a pattern of fraud and systematic abuse. The Courier-Journal even assigned a reporter to investigate the asylum's skyrocketing death rate. And those early questions? They were dangerous, because they were the first cracks in Crampton's carefully built facade. He realized his empire of lies was reaching a breaking point. Too many families were asking. Too many papers were circling. And the governor's political protection wouldn't last forever. Something had to be done. And Hannah Rutledge already had a plan to silence the troublemakers. By the fall of 1887, the air in central Kentucky turned colder than usual, as if the land itself recoiled from the horrors happening in Frankfort. The asylum no longer resembled a hospital at all. It had become an industrial-scale laboratory of human suffering. New subjects arrived almost daily. Crampton's leather journals filled an entire cabinet, chronicling 18 straight months of systematic torture, page after page of cold precision. But now his influence stretched far beyond the asylum's red brick walls. Through a network of corrupt magistrates and officials, he'd built a pipeline that funneled Kentucky's most vulnerable men directly into his hands. The nightmare was no longer contained. It was spreading. What if I told you men could lose their freedom, sometimes their lives, for something as small as public drunkenness or failing to pay off a debt? In late 19th century Kentucky, that wasn't just possible. It was policy. Judges, bribed by asylum funds, signed off on commitments without hesitation. And inside those walls, the fate of these men was sealed. Hannah Rutledge, the mastermind of daily operations, kept a standing order: 20 new patients every single week. She even requested specifics: strong young men, perfect for experiments that might one day serve the military; older, weaker subjects, sent straight into brutal toxicity trials where death came quickly. Women, usually avoided. Their disappearances stirred too much suspicion. But none of this could have worked without Wilhelm Brennan, a German immigrant who'd only come to Kentucky looking for honest work. Instead, he became a key figure in a nightmare. Wilhelm wasn't just fixing machines anymore. He was preserving organs for shipment, designing new equipment. And when things spilled outside the asylum's walls, he handled what Rutledge called external operations. The first came in September of 1887. Sarah Caldwell's quiet investigation into missing men had reached Senator Robert Fleming. He announced plans for a surprise inspection of the asylum. For Dr. Crampton, this was catastrophic. An inspection would reveal everything: the forged records, the body counts, the lies. But Hannah acted fast. On September 14th, Senator Fleming was found dead in his hotel room. Official cause? Heart attack. But the physician who signed off had been paid handsomely to avoid asking questions. His files, his notes, all vanished. The investigation died with him. At least that's what Crampton thought. Sarah Caldwell wasn't giving up. Fleming's death only convinced her that something far darker was being covered up. And as she dug deeper, her discoveries grew more disturbing. Letters poured in from families in Tennessee, West Virginia, even Southern Ohio. Stories that matched hers. Men being declared insane, shipped off, never seen again. This wasn't just Kentucky. It looked like a network. Thousands could be involved. Inside the asylum, one man was still fighting to be heard: Thomas Caldwell. Despite everything done to him, he clung to enough clarity to start documenting what he'd seen. With scraps of charcoal and torn cloth, he recorded names, equipment, even chemical formulas. Hidden under the floorboards of his cell, his journal became the silent record of more than 200 lost men. And he wasn't alone. A former school teacher, Benjamin Curtis, was memorizing details too. Together, they were trying to preserve the truth if they ever got out. Their chance came in October 1887. A fire broke out in the laundry building, pulling staff away. In the chaos, Thomas and Benjamin slipped out of their cells, heading for the main doors. Freedom was close. But Wilhelm spotted them. Guards swarmed the grounds, and Rutledge made the call. These men knew too much. No return to their cells this time. Instead, they were sent to the asylum's most feared place, the terminal ward. A death sentence. Benjamin Curtis didn't last the night. He was subjected to nerve agent trials, military-grade poisons that tore through his body within hours. Thomas survived, but only barely. Paralysis, neurological damage, and pain that never ended. Still, his mind stayed sharp enough to know. His days were numbered. Soon he'd be just another body hidden in Kentucky's limestone caves. But outside, Sarah Caldwell was gaining ground. She'd linked up with a federal investigator who specialized in medical fraud. Her evidence had reached Washington. For the first time, officials at the highest levels were paying attention. By November 1887, the first hard frost covered the asylum grounds, a glittering white mask over a building steeped in blood. And while the walls still held their secrets, cracks were beginning to spread. The haunting question remains: if this one asylum could run unchecked for 18 months, murdering hundreds under the banner of medical research. How many others were doing the exact same thing, hidden in plain sight across America? And that's just the beginning. If this story gripped you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because what happens next will shake everything you thought you knew about history. Have you ever wondered what happens when a man who calls himself a doctor starts to lose his grip on reality, while holding total control over human lives? By late 1887, Dr. Crampton was unraveling. The precise scientific mask he once wore had slipped. His journals, once neat records of experiments, now rambled with bizarre theories about pain, consciousness, and death, interrupted by grotesque sketches of dissected organs and faces captured at the very instant life left the body. As he descended deeper into obsession, Hannah Ruttles stepped up. She was now the one truly running the asylum. Her reach extended across 6 counties, using bribed judges and corrupt officials to keep the steady supply of victims flowing. But cracks were forming. Sarah Caldwell's letters had reached Washington, and now federal investigators were circling. The breaking point came on November 8, 1887. Federal Marshal James Douglas arrived in Frankfort with something no one had dared bring before: a federal warrant. His power was beyond state politicians, beyond the governor himself. For the first time, the asylum couldn't hide behind local corruption. Rutledge knew immediately, if Douglas got inside, the truth would end them all. She launched what she chillingly called the sterilization protocol. Everything had to be erased. Every record, every witness, every living subject. That night, Wilhelm Brennan worked furiously in the furnaces, feeding thousands of pages of files into the flames. Even Crampton's thick leather journals took hours to burn. But by dawn, nearly 2 years of documentation had turned to ash. But the paper trail wasn't the worst problem. 43 men were still alive inside the experimental wing. Witnesses, evidence. They couldn't be allowed to speak. Thomas Caldwell was among them. Despite his failing body and shattered nerves, he realized what was happening as guards marched men into a basement chamber no one had ever seen before. It wasn't a ward, it was an execution hall. Drains lined the floor to carry away blood and fluids. At midnight, the killing began. Ruttles herself took charge, syringe in hand, delivering lethal doses of morphine. One by one, the men fell. Benjamin Carter from Harlan County died clutching a wooden cross he'd carved in secret. James Mullins from Pike County whispered his wife's name as the poison stopped his heart. Thomas lay still, pretending to be unconscious when the guards came for him. It bought him time. Enough to see the horror unfold around him. But his turn was inevitable. Near dawn, he was strapped down, staring into Rutledge's icy blue eyes as she prepared the syringe. After surviving endless torture, this would be the end, not as a subject of an experiment, but as a liability, silenced before he could ever speak the truth. But fate had one last twist. Before Rutledge could deliver the injection, chaos erupted above them. Marshal Douglas had arrived earlier than expected, with federal agents who surrounded the asylum overnight. Guards scrambled in confusion. For the first time, the fortress of horror was vulnerable. Thomas seized his chance. With a burst of desperate strength, he broke free, grabbed a piece of equipment, and struck Rutledge hard enough to stagger her. Somehow he escaped the chamber and stumbled toward the main building, searching for the marshal. What he found was worse than even he could have imagined. The investigators weren't just uncovering human experimentation. They were exposing something far larger, a conspiracy stretching far beyond Kentucky. Organ trafficking, pharmaceutical trials, chemical weapons testing for the military. The asylum wasn't an isolated nightmare. It was one piece of a multi-state operation, and the most shocking revelation hadn't even been revealed yet. So what was uncovered inside those walls, and how far did this conspiracy really go? What if I told you that hidden inside a doctor's private safe were letters so disturbing they exposed an entire underground conspiracy? Correspondence that named every guilty player, revealed how the operation worked, and proved that what looked like medical progress was actually evil wearing a lab coat, protected by corrupt politicians, funded by companies that should have been dedicated to healing, and shielded by some of the most respected institutions in the country. Just when you think this story can't get darker, Frankfurt proves us wrong. If this tale is already sending chills down your spine, share it with a friend who loves unsolved mysteries, and stick with me because what investigators uncovered next is almost too horrific to believe. Picture this: Thomas Caldwell, blood pouring from his wounds, stumbling through the asylum's hallways. He wasn't just running for his life. He carried with him the key to unraveling one of the most brutal campaigns of human experimentation in American history. But here's the catch: who would believe him? On paper, he was insane, officially declared unstable, and yet his words, his testimony, became the spark investigators needed. Enter Federal Marshal James Douglas, a man hardened by 20 years of chasing corruption. But nothing prepared him for what he found in the basement of the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum. The execution chamber, concrete floors stained with blood, 42 men slaughtered in the hours before the raid, and it didn't look like medicine. It looked like the Spanish Inquisition had been reborn. Then came Thomas, barely conscious, shaking, incoherent, yet somehow still able to guide Douglas's team back into the asylum's darkest corners. What they saw left investigators speechless. Specialized devices designed to keep victims awake during painful experiments. Jars filled with preserved human organs. Chemical labs brewing compounds with no legitimate medical purpose. And most chilling of all, photographic plates capturing the agony on patients' faces. Organized by treatment type, as if this was some grotesque catalog. And where was Dr. Crampton, the man at the center of it all? Calmly seated at his desk, unshaken, almost annoyed that anyone would interrupt his work. When arrested for murder and conspiracy, his response was cold, detached. These weren't murders. They were sacrifices for science, for national defense. One day society will thank us. Hannah Rutledge, however, didn't stick around to be questioned. She slipped away in the chaos, armed with cash, contacts, and documents that suggested this wasn't just one asylum. She had networks in multiple states, that trail of evidence. It led investigators straight to the top. Governor James Proctor not exposed. Secret accounts, over $50,000 traced directly to asylum funds. His campaigns, his lifestyle, paid for in blood. And in return, he offered protection and access to results that could fuel Kentucky's budding pharmaceutical empire. But it didn't end there. Letters linked Crampton to Harvard Medical School. At first, investigators thought it was just cadaver trafficking. But the truth? Dr. Marcus Wainwright was running a network of researchers across the Northeast. They weren't just studying. They were experimenting on unwilling human subjects, sharing results, refining torture techniques, and pushing boundaries in the name of science. And the pharmaceutical companies? Far from innocent, Peton Pharmaceuticals supplied chemicals, along with detailed instructions, dosages, observation protocols, information that could only have come from previous human trials. Executives stayed hidden behind layers of dummy corporations. But their fingerprints were everywhere, and perhaps the most chilling discovery of all, military involvement. Yes, high-ranking officials had shown interest in Crampton's work, especially the nerve agents. These patients, these human beings, had been used as unwitting test pilots for chemical weapons meant to kill thousands on the battlefield. This wasn't just about medicine. It was about profit, power, and war. And then there was Wilhelm Brennan, the man who built the horrific machines, found cowering in limestone caves beneath the asylum, surrounded by evidence of how he'd disposed of the bodies. The picture was complete. Over 200 lives consumed by an unholy alliance of doctors, corporations, politicians, and the military. So the question is, how deep does this darkness really go? And how many more institutions were hiding the same kind of nightmare? What if I told you that beneath the hills of Kentucky, investigators stumbled into caves hiding hundreds of bodies, victims of a medical conspiracy so vast it stretched across 12 states? This wasn't just murder. It was a machine, a system, designed to harvest human lives while hiding under the mask of science. And the man at the center of it all? Dr. Silas Crampton. When federal marshals finally cornered Wilhelm Brennan, the German engineer who had built the asylum's grotesque machines, he collapsed under the weight of his guilt. Through tears, he revealed how bodies had been disposed of for years. Mass graves hidden deep inside cave systems and abandoned mine shafts. And when investigators followed his directions, what they found was worse than anyone had imagined. caves filled with skeletons. Some half-preserved, others twisted by experimental procedures. Personal belongings, wedding rings, pocket watches, photographs, stored neatly in containers like trophies of lives stolen. But the most damning discovery wasn't in the caves. It was in Crampton's office. Behind the fireplace, hidden in a secret compartment, lay his master journal. This wasn't just a diary of atrocities. It was a blueprint, detailed records of every experiment, letters connecting the asylum to similar facilities across the country, 12 states, dozens of institutions, all part of a shadow network run by physicians, pharmaceutical companies, and even government officials. Kentucky was never the end game. It was the prototype. A model for expansion. The plan? Build facilities across the South where corruption and poverty would keep outsiders from asking questions. Fund it all through organ trafficking and drug testing, a self-sustaining system of human slaughter disguised as medical progress. Thomas Caldwell's testimony became the heart of the investigation. Despite permanent brain damage and months of torture, his memory was sharp. Names, dates, places, even the exact procedures. He knew how victims were chosen and how the machine kept turning. Here's how it worked. Corrupt magistrates targeted the forgotten. Widowers, drifters, immigrants, men with no family to come looking. They were arrested on fake charges, labeled insane after laughably short exams, and shipped off to the asylum. Once inside, they vanished forever into the experimental wing. And the money? It was flowing everywhere. Magistrates pocketed $50 per prisoner, more than a month's salary. Deputies got bonuses for transport. Coroners were paid to sign off fraudulent death certificates. The justice system itself had become a conveyor belt feeding human lives into Crampton's experiments. The investigation following Thomas's escape became one of the largest federal inquiries of the 19th century. For 6 long months, Douglas and his team collected evidence, over 3,000 pages of testimony, documents, and physical proof. They confirmed the deaths of at least 214 men. Crampton was dragged into federal court in Louisville in the summer of 1888. The charges: murder, conspiracy, fraud, and violations of the Federal Food and Drug Act. The trial lasted 7 weeks. Newspapers couldn't print the details fast enough. America was horrified. Thomas Caldwell took the stand, and though defense lawyers tried to discredit him as unstable, his story never faltered. Day after day, he recounted the tortures he endured, the victims he'd seen, the names of those responsible. Every word chipped away at Crampton's defense. And the doctor himself? Cold, emotionless. Even as survivor after survivor testified, he sat there like a man inconvenienced by noise. When finally given a chance to speak before sentencing, his words chilled the courtroom. History will vindicate my methods. These men did not die in vain. Their deaths will save more lives than their existence ever could. Judge Robert Boyd disagreed. He sentenced Crampton to hang. On December 15, 1888, in the courtyard of Louisville Federal Prison, Silas Crampton met the rope. Among the witnesses, Thomas Caldwell, who lived to see justice done. But the story didn't end there. Hannah Rutledge, the mastermind behind the asylum's day-to-day horrors, vanished during the raid. For years, strange deaths at medical facilities across the South hinted she was still out there, working under new names. She was never caught. Wilhelm Brennan, on the other hand, cooperated. He helped investigators locate bodies in the caves and received a reduced sentence, 20 years. He served 14, was deported to Germany, and lived quietly until 1919. The political fallout was massive. Governor Knott resigned in disgrace. Legislators lost careers, and pharmaceutical companies faced congressional hearings, though most wriggled free through money and influence. Peton Pharmaceuticals quietly paid off victims' families. Other companies simply rebranded and carried on. Even Harvard's involvement was swept under the rug. Dr. Marcus Wainwright resigned and disappeared, while the university claimed ignorance of his crimes and the wider network. It was never fully exposed. Too many records burned before investigators arrived. As for Thomas, he returned home to Wolfe County. But he was never the same. His wife Sarah cared for him until his death in 1904. Sarah carried his story further, traveling across Kentucky, fighting for reforms that would prevent such horrors from happening again. The asylum itself was demolished, its ruins erased. A new mental health facility rose in Lexington, this time with strict oversight. Yet, questions remain. Reports surfaced of suspicious activity in Tennessee, West Virginia, Ohio. Investigations were blocked, underfunded, or quietly shut down. The sealed caves near Frankfurt still hold secrets. Local residents swore they heard strange sounds from beneath the earth for years after. The truth? We may never know the full number of victims, confirmed, but evidence suggested many more. Silent witnesses still entombed in stone. And here's the part that should keep you awake tonight. This wasn't just a story about the 1880s. The forces that made it possible, corruption, greed, ambition, still exist today. When science breaks free from ethics, when institutions serve profit over people, atrocities don't just become possible, they become inevitable. The Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum stands as a chilling reminder. Evil often wears the mask of progress. Thomas Caldwell's courage kept the victims from being forgotten. But whether the world truly learned from this nightmare remains uncertain. So what do you think? Could something like this still be happening, just hidden in plain sight? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Share this story with someone who loves dark mysteries. And if you want more tales like this, subscribe, hit the bell, and stay tuned, because the past still has secrets. And some of them are darker than you can imagine.